The question is whether different plug-in emulations of a particular hardware processor sound the same. Note that this is not whether they sound the same as the original hardware. This is impossible to test unless access is available to the exact piece of equipment that was modelled. Vintage hardware changes as it ages, and it cannot be expected that two examples of the same piece of equipment will sound exactly the same decades after they were manufactured. There should be a clue in this. Different plugins will be modelled on different examples of the hardware equipment. The only way they are likely to be modelled on the same example is if the development teams hire the same unit from a Pro Audio hire company. So the question changes slightly. Two plug-in emulations of a particular hardware processor are very likely to sound different to each other. But how different? And does it matter? In this demonstration, we will look at the well-known Pultec EQP-1A equalizer. In its emulations by NoiseAsh and Waves, the Pultec EQ1A and the Waves Puigtec EQP-1A. In this demonstration, we will focus on drums, using a groove from the Native Instruments Studio Drummer contact library. First, an EQ boost will be applied, using the same settings on both plugins. Next, a demonstration of EQ cut, once again using the same settings on both plugins. Finally, comparisons that switch back and forth between the Pultec EQ1A and the Waves Puigtec EQP-1A to help tune in your ears to any differences. In all cases, we have normalized the levels, so subjectively, all of the clips should sound equally loud. In more detail, the levels have been normalized to -23 LUFS using the Waves WLM Plus loudness meter. Firstly, let's listen to the drums without EQ. This is a good recording of drums that is neither too dull nor too bright and would take EQ well. Let's listen again. Now let's listen to the same thing with an interesting EQ boost on the Pultec EQ1A. The settings were made purely subjectively to values that would be useful if a bright-sounding drum set was required. As you can see, there is a low-frequency boost at 100 Hz and also a high-frequency boost at 8 kHz. This is just one setting out of very many that could have been used, but it will serve well for the purpose of this demonstration. There is a distinct difference in brightness to the flat version. Let's compare flat, then equalized. Now let's listen to the Waves version of the Pultec EQP-1A. This is interesting. The Waves version isn't as bright as the Pultec, using the same settings. As well as frequency balance differences, you might also listen for differences in the amount of warmth or distortion in the signal. This is a subjective judgment, but the Pultec may seem to be a little more gritty than the Waves. This isn't a bad thing. One of the reasons for using vintage hardware emulations is exactly for this kind of texture. Also, it's impossible to say that one is better than the other. It depends on personal taste and the context of the work in hand. There doesn't seem to be so much difference in the low frequency range, and for any practical purpose, it would probably make no difference at all. Of course, with more extreme settings, or a different sound source, perhaps the differences in the low frequency range would be more noticeable. Moving on to EQ cut. Once again, here is the flat version. And now the Pultec EQ1A with low frequency attenuation at 100 Hz and high frequency attenuation at 10 kHz. 10 kHz might seem high, but the effects extend down into the high mid-range. The two controls that are relevant to the high frequencies in this example are at the top right, attenuation and attenuation select. Now the Waves Puigtec EQP-1A with the same settings. As before, the Pultec is rather brighter than the Waves Puigtec for the same settings. Also, subjectively, the Waves version seems a little bit smaller and not as upfront. Again, this is not a bad thing. It's a different sound texture that might well be perfect given an appropriate context. Finally, two comparison tests. In the first of these, the audio will alternate each bar between the Pultec EQ1A and the Waves Puigtec EQP-1A, with EQ boost settings as before. And lastly, a similar alternating test with EQ cut settings, as before. As you can hear, there is a difference between these two plug-in emulations of the same model of vintage hardware equalizer. It is important to remember, however, that this demonstration is of only one sound source and we've only tested two settings. You might prefer one plug-in to the other in this demonstration, but of course in real life you could adjust the settings of either to craft the sound to exactly the way you want to hear it. These are both very competent plugins, and a good engineer could produce work of fully professional quality with either. I'm David Mellor, Course Director of Audio Masterclass. If you'd like to learn more about audio, come to audiomasterclass.com and take a look at our range of online audio courses. Thank you for listening.